Hi, I'm Rick Bleiweiss, and I'm here with Howard Bloom again, and for another fascinating episode. So Howard, shoot away.
Okay, so Blackstone Audio. Rick is a major executive at Blackstone Audio. And in 1981, I was flying back to New York City from LA. And next to me was a stewardess deadheading, in other words, taking a free trip on the airline. And she said, there's this thing you really ought to get since you love books so much. And it's called audiobooks. And she gave me the name of the biggest Audible company at the time. And I went through everything in their catalog of interest to me, everything. And finally ran out, by the way, so I was listening both to their books and to Blackstone books, the two major suppliers in 1981. The Walkman had just been invented.
Right.
So this opened the audiobook up for whole new uses.
Yep.
And most of my reading life since then, well, initially for the first 10 years, it was all Blackstone and whatever this other company was called, Books on Tape,
Yep.
is what it was called.
They originated it. Yes, they were,
right.
I think, HarperCollins or Penguin, one or the other.
Right. So, I mean, the big trick in life is summed up by Andrew Marvell in his To His Coy Mistress. And he says, let us roll up all our strength and sweetness into one ball and roll it with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we will make him run. In other words, you've got a limited lifetime.
Right.
And so how in the world do you trump death? Well, you try to live 7 lifetimes in one.
That's right.
Taking advantage of every minute you've got. And so Blackstone Audio and whatever it was called then, Books
on Tape.
Books on Tape, right. They made it possible for me to cram reading into all kinds of neglected corners of time. For example, there's an absolutely hideous book, but a very important one by the philosopher George Hegel, called Philosophy of History. The book is so unreadable that when I went to the library fact-checking for my first book, The Lucifer Principle, and I hold out the book, they'd had it since 1905. And in those days, they used to join the pages, so you had to slit the pages apart.
Yeah.
The pages had never been slit. This is such heavy-duty reading that no one had even attempted it in almost 100 years. But in those days, Books on Tape, for a brief period, took in books from a guy who was a terrible reader, but who was fascinated by arcane but important books, books that very few people, except for scholars, are going to rent.
Right.
And even though he did a terrible job reading them, it didn't matter because you got the book one way or the other.
Right.
So I read that entire book while washing dishes after dinner, night after night after night. And, a time which otherwise in the days before the Walkman would have been wasted. I made it all the way through the book. The essential message of that book has been coloring my writing ever since. So, and what does this have to do with outrunning the sun, with outrunning your lifetime? Cram 7 fucking lifetimes into one, for God's sakes.
I know. I just to diverge a second. I'm writing the second 𝐬𝐿 book now. I'm finishing it, and one of the lines in the book that Scorbion says to the people around him is, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close to it, and it's exactly what you're talking about. Treat every day as you would the same way as if you found a sack of money. Enjoy it and spend it wisely.
Right. Very good. And once upon a time, I had a friend. I probably told you this story. And he was considerably older than I am. So whenever we talked, I used to tell him, every day you wake up is the first day of the most important 20 years of your life.
Right.
And he listened with absolute fascination. He was riveted. One day I decided to look up his age on Wikipedia.
Okay.
And at that point, he was 78 years old. I was in my 60s, a younger man. Well, now that advice that I used to give to him is very important to me because I'm just getting started with some of the most important projects of my life. The Howard Bloom Institute, for example, which is now up and running. I have to listen to my own advice. Now, the friend to whom I told that was Buzz Aldrin.
Okay. Wow. So
So
talk about the Howard Bloom Institute. As long as you brought it up, talk about it.
Well, there's a film. It's a 62-minute film. It's won 2 festival awards. It's called The Grand Unified Theory of Howard Bloom. And in that movie, they track me as I'm trying to get together a will to will all of my property to the Howard Bloom, to establish a Howard Bloom Institute after I'm gone.
Okay.
The general idea of the Howard Bloom Institute is this. You know that when I was 10 years old, absolutely nobody in my hometown of Buffalo, New York wanted to have anything to do with me. The other kids didn't want me around when they were playing, and my parents acted as if I was a piece of furniture. And then a book landed in my lap one day, and it said the first 2 rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it told the story of Galileo. And look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And it told the story of Anton von Leeuwenhoek. And it suddenly gave me a reason for living and a gang I could hang out with for a very simple reason. Nobody could say no to me because they were dead. But the important point is that Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek reached out over 350 years to catch me before I could fall.
That's fabulous.
So my job ever since has been to reach out over the next 350 years to catch the next poor lost kid before he can fall.
Cool.
And so the Howard Bloom Institute is designed to, if you're going to reach out 350 years in the future, you have to build the equivalent of a lighthouse tower. Something that will be able to have a beacon that can reach out across the time, the way that a beacon and a lighthouse reaches out across the surface of the sea. And so the Howard Bloom Institute is there to promote my ideas, to promote my work, to promote my way of thinking. And this sounds terribly egotistical. But in fact, a long time ago, I started to get letters from people saying, I just read your book, fill in the name of the blank of the book, and I was confused and without a purpose, and you gave me a way to live. You gave me a reason to live. And 10 years later, I started getting letters, emails saying I was 15 and you saved my life with your book. And I've been using your way of thinking ever since. So I started to keep a file of these statements when they came in, because I have been most of my life clinically depressed, which means depressed from every waking second of the day. And if I got more depressed than usual, I had these things to consult to remind me that I'm of some value to my fellow human beings. Because when you're really depressed, you wake up in the morning and you don't feel it's worth getting up because you know not a damn soul wants to have anything to do with you.
Right.
And you're of no value to anyone. So this was to remind me that I'm of some value to somebody. And that list, which I never consult, when you're depressed, you're too depressed to look at a list like this, to catch 22. So that list, which started out at a couple of pages, is now 550 pages long.
Wow.
So the point is, here I am working to lift the next poor kid 350 years down the line. But apparently in the process, ever since my first book came out in 1995, I've been lifting people, my contemporaries, people who are younger than I am. So when people saw the movie, they got back to me and said, I want to be a member of the Howard Bloom Institute. Well, the Howard Bloom Institute didn't exist yet. I thought it would come together after I was dead. And finally, there were enough of them that I realized that if I put them together, we would have a Howard Bloom Institute.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I put these people together. Now, most of them are around the age of 30,
Okay.
which is fabulous
It
because
is.
that means I'm 78. It means I'm reaching back to a generation almost 50 years behind me or ahead of me or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
A generation that's a feeler into the future. And so the Howard Bloom Institute, I write 2 to 3 pieces a week in addition to working on my 8th book. And they put those 2 to 3 pieces a week up on the blog site. And we've started a program. I created a discipline in 2021 or 2001 called Omnology. It is a field for the promiscuously curious, for people who are carnivorously curious.
Yes.
And its basic message is, well, it's there for a kid in a sophomore year of college whose dad sits him down and says, look, you're interested in art history. You're interested in neuroscience. You're interested in cinema. You've got to make up your mind. Are you going to be an art historian? Are you going to be a neuroscientist? Or are you going to be a filmmaker? And until you make up your mind, you're nobody. And Omnology is there so you can say to dad, screw you. I have these 3 passionate curiosities. I'm going to follow them for as long as they drive me. They're the source of my energy. They're my greatest asset. And when I hit the age of 40, and so do my friends, and all of them are wondering why in the world they're on this planet to begin with, and the women are planning elaborate divorces to find out who they are, and the men are buying little red sports cars and picking up blondes and cheating on their wives. I'll just be coming back from the desert of my multiple curiosities with my first answers, my first big pictures. And while my friends feel that they're at the end of their lives, I will know that I'm at the very beginning of mine.
That's cool.
So that's what Omnology is all about. So a research scientist named Cheyenne G is heading the Omnology initiative. And Kepler Space University has said yes to a 4 to 6 week course on Omnology,
Right.
which Cheyenne is putting together. And ultimately what Cheyenne wants to reach is 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. But that's a little ways down the road.
So if somebody wanted to know more about the Omnology, is there a place they can go, and the Howard Bloom Institute? In other words, how could people plug into these, learn more about them?
Okay, it's Howard Bloom, all one word with 2 O's in the Bloom,
Right.
.institute.
Okay.
That's the whole thing, howardbloom.institute. So meanwhile, there's another project. I wrote a manifesto for the future of life and humanity a few years ago, and it was adopted as the official vision of the National Space Society.
Wow.
It's called Garden the Solar System, Green the Galaxy. And one of our members in Scotland is working on recruiting a college animation class to take on the project of doing a short version of Garden the Solar System, Green the Galaxy as an animation. And he and I have worked together on previous animations. He delivers.
Cool.
And then there's another project I'm putting together. It hasn't come together yet, called it's called Saving Western Civilization, or Save Democracy.
Okay.
And it's based on a kind of radical reperception of the entire Western system that I went through in the process of writing The Genius of the Beast, my 3rd book. And it points out that every system that calls on our idealism says that it's going to lift the poor and the oppressed. But there's one system that has done it so spectacularly better than any other that it's ridiculous. And it's the Western system. And the West, if you've been born in England in 1850, you would have had a life expectancy of 38.5 years. If you've been born in England or the United States in 2020, your life expectancy would have been 78.5 years. That's an increase of 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
more than doubling the human lifespan.
Yep.
If you check out the wages of the poorest paid workers, Irish dock workers in London in 1850, and compare it with the wages of the poorest paid worker in London in 2020, a personal assistant. That personal assistant earned what 7 dock workers, what an entire tenement full of dock workers and their families earned in 1850. If you gave a Stanford Binet IQ test from 1916, the first year the test was administered, to just a random smattering of kids today, kids who, according to various books, have been flattened, dumbed down, decorticated by the internet and by their cell phones and apps, TikTok. So if you gave them that Stanford Binet IQ test, they would register at marginal genius on the score, the testing patterns of 1916. In other words, we've added 35 points to the average IQ.
Wow.
And the most important, a minor thing, we are 4 inches taller than we were back in 1900. And the Dutch are 7 inches taller than they were back in 1900. But the most important thing is, if you were born into one of those lovely indigenous societies that live in harmony with nature and at peace with their fellow man, or if you had been born in England in 1650, your odds of dying a violent death at the hands of a fellow human being were 10 times what they are today. In other words, we have increased the peace in the world by a factor of 10.
Wow.
And so
it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like that all the time.
Right, especially now with Russia massing 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border.
Right.
With China threatening to take back Taiwan. So nonetheless, if our great-great-grandparents could increase the peace in the world by a factor of 10, surely we owe our great-great-grandkids another decrease in violence by a factor of 10. If our great-great-grandparents could add 40 years to our lifespan, then we owe at least another 40 years to our great-great-grandkids. If our great-great-grandparents could give us 35 extra points on our IQ, surely we owe an extra 35 points to our great-great-grandkids. And if our great-great-grandparents could increase the average or the poorest paid worker's wage by 7 times, then surely we need to take that wage from roughly $10 an hour to $70 an hour as a minimum wage for our great-great-grandkids. And this is, we're not talking about inflation. We're talking about real value of money. So that is the essence of a manifesto on why I save Western civilization. These are things the West does not know about itself. After I came up with my list, Steven Pinker, who read the Lucifer Principle and copped some material from it, and thanked me for it. He was kind enough to do that. Steven Pinker came out with 2 books, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I'm not sure what the one was after that, also saying the same kinds of things. Well, the initiative to save democracy, to save democratic values, is a very important one. 2 people have volunteered for it. I mean, well, first, okay. 2 people have volunteered for it. David Paterson, who's the former governor of New York State, wants to be involved. Harry Hamlin, who's the actor and the founder of a nuclear fusion company, wants to be involved with that. And I'm just looking for somebody to head it. Now, another thing to know about the Howard Bloom Institute, the honorary advisory board is staggering. David Paterson, the former governor of New York State, Richard Foreman, MacArthur Genius Award-winning god of avant-garde theater, James Burke, who put together 7 BBC TV series, including Connections and The Day the Universe Changed, and those 2 are mind-blowing series. Robert Walker, the former head of the House Science Committee, 5 scientists, people from all over the world And what else? It's a ton more. Oh, Jeff Bridges.
Oh, cool.
Harry Hamlin, who I've mentioned before.
Right.
And there's 21 people of this caliber on the advisory board now. So, and am I missing anybody important? Let me look at my notes, if I can operate this little turbo note here. No, that's not the, yes, it is the right place. Okay, so where's my list? Okay, no, I gave you all of those. Martin Beaujewald, who wrote the textbook on quantum cosmology.
Wow.
Peter Garretson, the former head of the Future Science and Technology branch of the Air Force, etc. So we have a stellar group of people who are involved.
Absolutely.
And who believe, strangely enough, believe in this idea that there is a perceptual shift, or many of them, inherent in my body of work. So the idea is to turn the ways that you think, upside down, inside out, backwards and forwards, so you can understand things in whole new ways and get a far greater handle on the things going on inside of you and the things going on around you.
So Howard, for people who have not been aware of your books but are listening to this,
right,
watching it, what order would you suggest they read your books in to be able to, fully get everything that you write and talk about?
Well, they could start with the 66-minute documentary, The Grand Unified Theory of Howard Bloom, because that's easy.
Right.
My books I write to be as delicious as is humanly possible. So clear that anyone can understand them. And I guess in order, in chronological order, they're the God problem, which talks about the origins of the universe and our logic, our reason, our ways of going about doing things in science, our ways of understanding things. But believe me, it is a totally, what is the word? It's a heretical book in science.
Yeah.
But it's based on science because I've spent my life in science.
I know.
The second book is Global Brain, because it's about the organization of life on our planet and of something greater than just life itself, of a planetary brain, a planetary information exchange, which has been going on for 3.85 billion years. Didn't start with us. The next book is The Lucifer Principle,
right,
because it's a book about the origins of evil.
Okay.
The next book would be The Muhammad Code, because all of my books are about mass behavior, from the mass behavior of quarks to the mass behavior of human beings.
Right.
And the greatest example of imperialism and colonialism in the history of the world is Islam. So if you purport to be an expert in mass behavior, from the mass behavior of quarks to the mass behavior of human beings, and you don't understand Islamic culture, then you're missing one of the biggest examples of mass behavior literally in human history. And frankly, our current university courses, our high school history courses, they've been pressured to not give this, and they're too ignorant to give it anyway. They don't know it exists. It's very important to know it exists, because it's one of the superorganisms, one of the major bodies of energy and geopolitical movement on this planet today. The next book would be The Genius of the Beast, a radical revision of capitalism, because it talks about that form of human mass behavior called an economy.
Okay.
And then for kicks, you can read How I Accidentally Started the 60s, which is my memoir of how I accidentally helped start the hippie movement, really accidentally. And then you can read Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, which tells the later story of my involvement in the music industry, which was my scientific field expedition into mass behavior, into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made, and the things that I learned about the collective experience, which are fascinating. They're just amazing. It was an astonishing thing for a science person to be given that privilege.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the order of the books. And but so all the stories I tell you about my rock and roll life are in the context of a much broader project.
Right.
A project I've basically been doing literally since the age of 12. And it's putting the whole universe on a common timeline so that you can see the relationship of everything from the Big Bang to Andrew Marvel's poetry.
Right. Hey, let me ask you a question. Just this is sideways of what we're talking about, but it also plays in. How do you write? Do you outline your books? Do you just, it flows out of your brain and it's your job to capture it? Do you have a writing routine? You know, when you decide to write a book, what's the way you do it?
Well, all of the above. I don't actually write out an outline. I take a lot of notes, and then I put them in a rough order. But until now, what I used to do, I used to go over to the tea lounge, or I did this while I was still stuck in bed. I would dedicate 5 hours a day to writing. It's a very intense proposition. Sentences come to your brain. It's very hard to remember them.
Oh, yeah.
If people interrupt you for even a second, the sentence disappears.
Yep.
Utterly. And the idea of what came after that, what was supposed to come after that sentence.
Yep.
So it's a difficult process. These days, I run 4 space groups, among other things. And I'm a key figure in the Howard Bloom Institute. So my time is heavily booked. So what I've done with my 8th book, it turns out that I wrote most of the chapters for my 8th book in something like 2014. And then I set them aside when somebody convinced me, my friend Eric Gardner, convinced me that I needed to write down my rock and roll stories before I lost them.
Got it.
So I had set aside 32 chapters of a book.
Wow.
And for the first time in the process of putting this one together, my job has been to be an archaeologist, to excavate in my work until I could find these hidden chapters, and then bring them to the surface and organize them, and rewrite them, and try to see further into the point that I was, or the points that I was trying to make. The new book, the one I'm writing right now, is The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. Everything you know about nature is wrong.
Oh, that's a great title.
And so I've now got 32 chapters out. I now have to write 2 chapters that I didn't write before, and then I should be finished with the book. But because I'm doing so much else, what I do is at the beginning of my workday, 5:45 is about the beginning of my workday in the afternoon.
Okay.
And so at the beginning of the workday, I try to set aside a couple of hours just to work on the new book.
Right.
And then to get to my email, because there's important stuff happening in that email. You can see from the honorary advisory board the quality of people
Yeah, absolutely.
that I'm dealing with,
Absolutely.
or friends of mine now. And these people are just rich in possibility when it comes to organizing them for a major perception shift, which is what we need. We have to stop thinking that we're the worst civilization in history of mankind and the bloodiest. We're not. We're neither the bloodiest nor the worst.
Yeah, I could believe that.
And until you understand the history of Islam, you don't understand what the alternatives are. It's too bad I haven't been able to write a book on China in 1965. Well, when I was 16 years old, I was writing to the woman I loved at that point, a 16-year-old like me, saying, I intend to someday relocate to Asia. So I was fascinated with China at that point, and I've been fascinated with China ever since. But I am able to grok, if you know that word, to viscerally comprehend radical Islam. I can feel and think like a radical Islamist, the kind of person who would do a suicide bombing. But I have never been able to put myself empathically into the heart of a person from China. despite despite I guess it's like 50 years or something like that of reading up on China like crazy, despite having a house guest for the last 3 years who was born and raised in China. I still don't really comprehend it.
Well,
But I'm still trying. At any rate,
what is it about China that makes it so much harder to comprehend than Islam?
well, if I knew, I would tell you, but I haven't found the key yet. I mean, the trick with these things is finding a key. I've been studying Islam for 40 years, but it wasn't until 2003 that I finally realized where the source code is for Islam. And it's in the Quran, of course. The Quran is a jumble. It's things from one period in time followed by something that came before it. And it refers to historical events that are not explained in the Quran at all.
Right.
So the rest of the source code is really the early biographies of Muhammad. They were written 200 years after his death, 300 years after his death. But those tell the stories that make sense of what's in the Quran.
Got it.
So by scholars like Ibn Ishaq and Al-Tabari. And when I discovered that that was the source code, all of a sudden, all the stuff I've been studying on Islam for decades fell into place. I've never found that source code for Chinese civilization, despite reading the works of Confucius. And I haven't read the Taoist great scholar, whoever he was. Maybe I should one of these days, but keeping up with 𝐸 Jinping's way of thinking is hard enough.
Yeah.
Because Xi Jinping, well, no, keeping up with his way of thinking is easy. Because Xi Jinping and the Chinese nation believed that they went through a period of vast humiliation at the hands of the West in the 1800s. They had been the Middle Kingdom, the one kingdom between the earth and the heavens, the one kingdom around who all other kingdoms and principalities revolved since roughly 2,000 years ago. They have been the world's greatest exporting nation.
Right.
From 2,000 years ago on up to the 1800s. And then the Europeans invented something called the steamship.
Right.
And they invented metal alloys that could allow their artillery pieces to be not mere cannonballs, but projectiles that could travel 2 to 3 times as far as old artillery pieces. Which is ironic because the country that invented the cannon is China. So we went in with our gunships, our steam-powered gunships, and we subjected China to an opium war, which is not fair. The British had been paying for things from China in silver, and they started to run out of silver. So they came up with a bright idea. Why don't we take advantage of the Asian countries we own that make opium? And why don't we get the Chinese hooked on opium so we can pay them with opium?
Really?
And it worked. And the Chinese did just what we would do. The Chinese tried to clamp down on opium. And in response, the British sent over their warships, driven by steam, not dependent on the wind, with artillery that could shoot 2 to 3 times as far as the Chinese artillery, and basically took China over. There was something called the Boxer Rebellion. It was put down by the British. In other words, China went from being the #1 nation in the world to humiliation. And Xi Jinping's goal is to reverse that humiliation. And there's another problem that he wants to reverse. In roughly 1405 or 1420, an actually Muslim eunuch, Chinese, put together a fleet of ships like the world had never seen. These were ships that were the equivalent of skyscrapers, large apartment buildings, laid on their side on the surface of the sea. They were huge. And the Chinese started to send out a series of expeditionary missions to the Middle East and to East Africa. And then the emperor said, why are we wasting our money on this?
Okay.
It's meaningless. It's of no value whatsoever. And he had the entire navy of these magnificent ships destroyed.
Really?
Yes. So then came the Europeans, who did the same thing with much smaller ships, exploration.
Mhm.
And they found a route around Africa up to Asia. And they did things like sailing, or not sailing, they weren't sailing. Well, yes, they were sailing into an Asian harbor, seeing boatloads of pilgrims on their way to Mecca and sinking those boats.
Wow.
Monstrous things.
Yeah. Wow.
And so Xi realizes that we are on the shores of the next great ocean. And the United States is showing signs of weakness, not being willing to explore that ocean, not being willing to develop that ocean. And China plans to develop it. And China plans to own it. And it's called space.
Okay.
So these are two elements of what Xi Jinping calls the Chinese dream. So even though I cannot understand the average Chinese person in the streets,
Right.
I seem to be getting a handle on Xi Jinping. And then apparently his Stalinist, Leninist background is important in the way that he sees things. So, and right now, China, which I was interested in 1959, and have been interested in ever since, has become the country where you want to go if you want to see the future at work.
Wow.
It has the most advanced infrastructure in the world. It is way ahead of us in many respects because we've fallen behind. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan convinced us that government is evil and that you could make the world a better place by defunding government. You know, he said that when a government person comes to your door and knocks and says, I'm here to help, that's the beginning of your troubles. So we've been defunding the government ever since. We've been doing it in the name of not leaving a load of debt to our children and grandchildren. Well, guess what? About 2 years ago, it became obvious that student loan debt was over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
And now it's still not obvious to us, despite what Joe Biden is doing with his infrastructure bill. But the United States is about $5 trillion behind in infrastructure development. $1.75 billion is just the tiniest scratch. So what have we done in the name of Ronald Reagan, or by following the instincts of Ronald Reagan? We've loaded our children and ourselves at this point with $6 trillion of debt. But one of those forms of debt is not just debt, it's worse than that. It is 40 years of infrastructure decay. And now, if you want to see a backward country, go to the United States. If you want to see the future, go to China. How the hell do we catch up with that? Biden is the only one who seems to realize we must. But his messages are not getting out, the Chinese messages, not at all. But, you know, when I was 15 or 6, look, from the time I was 14, poetry was incredibly important to me. I had a brown shag rug in my bedroom, and there was a book with a brown cover laying on the floor at all times. The floor was where I did everything. So that was not space to tread on. That was space in which to act.
Right.
And as a consequence, you could trip over at any time. It was Louis Untermeyer's anthology of modern poetry.
Okay.
And in my high school, we were supposed to study the poetry of T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
And I read it and read it and read it. And I thought, this guy's pulling a con, the way that Picasso was pulling a con. He's using Greek and he's using Italian and he's using Latin, so that somebody who wants to think he or she is intelligent will look at it, not understand a word of it, but say, oh, of course I love T.S. Eliot. Why? Because it proves he's a real intellectual or she's a real intellectual. And then somebody recommended that I read a book called 𝐼𝐸𝐵𝐷𝐿. 𝐼𝐸𝐵𝐷𝐿 was a book by a literary critic. And in one paragraph, he gave me the key to opening up the words of T.S. Eliot. And all of a sudden, T.S. Eliot's poetry, especially the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, became a critical part of my life. Absolutely critical. And it said, if you feel that you have something heroic in life to do that will define you, that will bring women to your feet, kissing your ankles, then you must do it now. You must start it this hour, not even tomorrow, this hour. Why? Because there you will come to you will put this thing off, whatever it is, thinking that you will get around to doing it when you've amassed more money and amassed more free time. And then you'll wake up one day and realize that the life energy that it would have taken to do that astonishing thing has passed. And you will never be it. You've wanted to be that, you felt it was you all of your life, and you never were it at all. Instead, you were an insipid, ordinary person of no particular consequence. So the message, I took that message to heart at the age of 15 and 16. And then came a poem by a woman named Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Okay.
And it said, in essence, if you want to be able to see the infinite in the tiniest of things, you must open your empathic center and be able to experience the suffering of people all over the world, no matter what their geographic location, no matter what their culture. You have to be able to absorb it. And so those two poems meant so much to me, Rick, that I would go to a jazz club and wait until the musicians finished. First came the musicians that were scheduled for that night. Then came the musicians who'd been playing bar mitzvahs and weddings to relax by playing some music. And then came Howard Bloom reading to you the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Renaissance, the poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And it took me 30 or 40 years to realize what I was doing. I was reading these as an urgent call to the people I was addressing. That I knew. What I didn't realize is I was reciting these poems as an urgent call to myself.
Okay.
And so I've lived my life according to those principles and the first two rules of science ever since, which explains maybe why I've done a strange omnological trick, and I've been published or given lectures at scholarly conferences in 12 different scientific fields. I've been asked to do a 13th, genetics.
Oh, wow.
In May in Japan, but I don't think Japan is necessarily going to be allowing people in in May. So we'll see what happens. So that's it. I mean, and of course, the rock and roll adventure was an extraordinarily important part of this process because I never wanted to understand things from a distance just by reading books and articles. You need to understand things through immersion.
Yep.
And this was an incredible immersion experience in the forces of history of all things.
You know, we don't have a lot of time left, so I think we're going to save like some of your music industry stories for the next session.
Okay, that makes sense.
Let me just ask you to go back to the genetics that that you've been asked to speak about. So I've been following Bruce Lipton and the whole concept of epigenetics and you are what you think, you know, that
Right.
your emotions, your mind affect everything, every part of every cell in your body. And, you
Right.
know, and I'm just wondering if you ascribe to that, and if that's part of what you're doing, or if it's a totally separate thing.
No, I don't think we understand what we really need to understand with genetics at all. It's a fascinating field. Many aspects of it are frankly beyond me. But we have a simple problem to solve. All we know is that genes, some genes, create proteins. Now, if all we are is proteins, you'd be a soup and I'd be a soup, and we'd have to walk around in Campbell's soup can.
Right,
Wouldn't
exactly.
walk around at all. But there's far more to what the genes do than simply cranking out proteins. They crank out forms like cells, like livers, hearts, brains. And we have no idea of how we do that. And we have no idea that we have no idea of how we do that. I put the problem, like, how in the world does a string build a box? How does a string of DNA, if we took your DNA, your genome,
Right,
the long molecule that contains all of your genes,
right,
inside of you, it's twisted and tangled in all kinds of complex but highly regulated ways. If we took it and we spread it out, we untangled it, it would be 3 feet long.
wow,
That's astonishing.
yeah, yeah,
How in the world does a string make a box?
right,
And we do not know. And as I said, we're not aware that we don't know this yet. So when I first got the email from the Chinese company putting together this World Gene Conference, I thought it was spam and started to throw it away. And then I saw it mentioned my article, The Bacterial Roots of the New Autocracy,
okay,
which was in Biosystems, a peer-reviewed journal. And at first I thought, no, I don't know anything about genetics. And then it occurred to me, holy moly, I'm saying that the group behavior of bacteria, who are our great, great, great foremothers, we're descended from them,
right,
has basic overarching patterns in common with the human behavior that we see in human history, with things like boom and bust, with things like a tendency toward autonomy, like democracy, or a tendency toward autocracy, totalitarianism, a single leader, cult of personality around a single leader. We can see the basic patterns underlying that in bacterial colonies. And if bacteria have the genes for this kind of social behavior, the odds are very good that they have passed their genes on to us.
right.
But one of the things genetics suffers from is that it hasn't recognized the importance of social behavior.
Oh, okay.
For example, in creating multicellular beings. And that is crucial that geneticists wake up to social behavior and social organization and how genes influence that, how genes turn us into Lego blocks that can be snapped together in large social structures. So I suddenly realized that, no, I don't, it may be that I don't feel I know anything about genetics, but the fact is I have an important question to raise at a conference of this kind. So, but the point is, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Babes, which also quotes the To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, those lines about let us all roll all our strength and spirit up into one ball and roll them with rough strife through the iron gates of life, thus though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we will make him run. That, and Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem, which in essence to me said you've got to accept every adventure you can get your hands on in life. You've got to adventure at the extremes if you're going to understand things.
Right.
Those have powered my life. And the result is that I've had about, well, I was asked to do a presentation in Bushwick, Brooklyn,
Yeah.
for an audience of roughly 35 people, and how I lived 7 lives in one. And so I decided to make a list of them. And when I finished the list, I had 29 different lives in one. But anything I can do, you can do better. So to any 15-year-old or 30-year-old who's listening to this now, anything I can do, you can do better. I'm merely a probe. I'm merely a test case. And I mean, I was the person that the poet in residence at NYU thought would be NYU's contribution to poetry, a next great successful poet. And I was on the cover of Art Direction magazine. Art Direction magazine, that's radically different.
Yes.
I edited, despite listening to Beethoven, Bartok, Rachmaninoff, and Stravinsky, I became a major figure in the popular music industry. And it gave me an opportunity to dive into subcultures that were just unbelievable, astonishing, that I never would have had access to without this Periscope position. And a whole bunch of other things. And as I said, if I can do it, you can do it. And why do it? Because your life will be far more zestful, and you never want to spend half of your life in regret over not having done the things that you felt would define you, the heroic deeds that you felt would define you.
Amen. I totally agree. Just totally agree.
So I should probably let you go.
Okay.
And we'll do Michael Jackson, but this is the grand framework, Rick, for everything else.
Yep. Absolutely. It is. You're absolutely right, Howard. Totally right.
Okay, well, I will let you go, and I will see you. We'll set up another time.
Right, and we'll talk about Michael and Bette Midler and John Mellencamp and a few other people that other people know about.
Yes, exactly. All right, have a great night.
Thanks. You too.